We've been going over a series on the book of Daniel. Bible school did Daniel a couple weeks ago, so I thought, it'd be good just to we did a couple of weeks before Bible school, and now we have a couple more weeks to finish off in the book of Daniel. Excuse me. Lose my shoe. So we're in Daniel chapter 5. If you have your own Bible, I encourage you to open it up to Daniel chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible at home, I encourage you to pick one up in the lobby. There's a bunch of Bibles on the table. Everybody needs your own Bible. You need your own Bible so that you can write in it, do notes in it, and bring it back to worship with you. Daniel chapter 5. It's interesting. When we look biblically, there's different phrases that we still use today that come from the Bible. And the one from Daniel 5 is the phrase, the writing on the wall. Now sometimes we talk about that, it's sort of a warning. Well, the writing on the wall is that this is going to happen if you continue to do this in your life. A phrase that 2,500 years ago came from Daniel. Well, Daniel chapter 5. Just to remind y'all, Daniel was a young teenager who in 605 BC was taken from Jerusalem, along with other people, to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So he was a young teenager taken. First 4 chapters we looked at talk about Daniel's life and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how God worked in their life, but not just their life, but also King Nebuchadnezzar's life. And we have here in chapter 5, verse 1, it says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. Well, we're going to have to go back. Chapter 5, verse 1 says, King Belshazzar. The end of chapter 4 says, Nebuchadnezzar, after he had lost his mind for a time, and God restored him, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 does this whole little speech about how powerful and great God is. And the end of chapter 4, he says, everything that God does is right, and His ways are just, and those who walk in pride, Yahweh God is able to humble. So King Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king at that time in the then known world, understood who Yahweh God was at the end of his life, bowed down and worshiped God. God gave him multiple chances in the first 4 chapters of Daniel. Now we see a change that takes place. If you just jump back to the first slide, Hank, you did good with that. Nebuchadnezzar dies in about 562 BC. When he dies, he's succeeded by his son, whose nickname was called Evil Merodach. But in reality, his son wasn't that bad. His son allowed one of the kings of Israel to be free from jail. We read that in 2 Kings 25. Well, he was executed by the next gentleman, the Nigurlaser, however you say his name, and he ruled for 6 years. He was then executed by a coup d'etat by a bunch of people. Would you really want to be a king if you think you're going to be executed by these other people who are following you? He was executed. Then this new king, the Nabonidus, he was elected by the people who were part of the coup d'etat to be the king. He reigned for a while, but towards the end of his reign, he started to stay away from Babylon, and he was off doing the fighting and the wars, and his son, which is Belshazzar, was ruling in Babylon itself. Follow that? Get the picture of how it's all moving down within the history? So the son is in Babylon, and his dad is off fighting wars. This is the part we're really not quite for sure. History books don't quite have it all put together. It's thought that his dad is off fighting against Darius, the Medes and Persians that we're going to see end up taking over. But we're not really for sure if he's off fighting or if he's down at his summer house down in the Saudi Arabia area and he's just away from Babylon. But that's what's going on, that this Belshazzar is the son of the king who's reigning, but he's also considered the king. If you remember, when Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC first ransacks Jerusalem, his dad is still king, and he's king. So they have two kings at one time. They're reigning together. Okay, so let's go back to chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. That's a lot of people, isn't it? While through excavations, through archaeology, it's been found out there's been some halls that they could serve up to 10,000 people at a party. 10,000 people at a party. And he's drinking wine with them. The end of chapter or verse 1. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father. Some people struggle with this because throughout here it's going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, his father. But within the Hebrew mindset of writing, his father also could be grandfather or great-grandfather. So while he's doing this, he gives orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. It's interesting because Nebuchadnezzar, 3 times, in 605 BC, another time I don't remember the date, and then I think it's 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar goes and he fights against Jerusalem, and in the 587 he finally destroys Jerusalem. That's when he goes in, he takes all the gold, all of the articles that are used in the temple, the religious articles in the worship of Yahweh God, Nebuchadnezzar takes them back to Babylon and puts them in storage. Doesn't use them, puts them in storage. In effect saying that my God, Nebuchadnezzar saying, my God is bigger and stronger than the Jewish God because I captured all the religious items and I can just put them in storage. Y'all follow with that? Sort of a way of saying, telling the people, your God's nothing, my God's number one. Well, Belshazzar takes it a step farther than what even his father or any of the other kings since King Nebuchadnezzar did, and he calls for the items to come out. And they use the items. So verse 3, so they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple. The king and his nobles, his wives, and the concubines all drank from them. Sort of like a good old-fashioned kegger. Or maybe college kids. I'm sure they're still doing the keggers. You know, they're drinking and they're having way too much to drink. Remember when King Herod had too much to drink? And he had his stepdaughter come in to dance for him? And then he says, what do you want? And the stepdaughter says, the head of John the Baptist. When we've had too much to drink, we do things that we should not be doing. We all know that. Well, they're drinking. And they're using the religious articles from the temple. And as they drank, verse 4, they praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone. And suddenly, Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. What's been found archaeologically is that within the royal palace, within one of these large halls, there was plaster, archaeologically? Yeah, you're all with me on that. Plaster on the wall behind where the king sat. For many years, people did not believe in King Belshazzar because there was no record of him other than the biblical record until the late 1800s, and there was unearthed some documents of this king. I find it so amazing that all archaeology tends to verify what the Old Testament has to say. Okay, so this finger's writing on the wall, and the king watches the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale. He was frightened. His knees knocked, and the Hebrew basically is saying his legs gave way and he peed his pants. That's basically what the Hebrew is saying. He lost control of his bowels. He was so scared. And the king called, for the enchanters, the astrologers, the diviners to be brought, and said to the wise men,